The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to the Texas Mortgage Bankers Association's Education Webinar Series, a part of the Education and Endowment Committee led this year by Pam Jenkins and Dave Taugenbaugh. My name is Chance Mann, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This webinar should take about an hour. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar using the chat questions window. If you have questions following the conclusion of the webinar, you may email Carol at the email address on the slide. We are thrilled to have Kristin Messerli joining us today. Kristin is the co-founder of the nonprofit FirstHome IQ, whose mission is to deliver homeownership education before the age of 25. Kristin has worked with hundreds of lenders, startups, and nonprofits to craft successful go-to-market strategies and build trust with their consumers. Kristin founded and sold the digital marketing agency Cultural Outreach with the mission to promote sustainable homeownership in underserved communities. She was previously the VP of Sales and Strategy at Experience.com and has consulted with numerous fintech startups across product design, marketing, and research. Kristin produced and authored the 2020 to 2023 NextGen Homebuyer Reports, sponsored by National MI, which highlighted key insights from over 4,000 Millennial and Gen Z consumers. Kristin holds a Master in Public Administration degree from the University of Oklahoma. With that, let's get started. Kristin, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I am going to share some slides with you guys today, actually a lot of slides. I am going to, as Chance mentioned, I have been doing research with Millennial and Gen Z homebuyers, well, millennials and now Gen Z, over the last decade, and then in the last 3 or 4 years, started putting together annual reports that were sponsored by National MI. You can access those reports at nextgenhomebuyer.com. And I'm going to share a lot of that data with you today that's relevant to capturing this market. We have done an annual report that's just looking at the NextGen homebuyer sentiment, how they're feeling, what their thoughts are, what their barriers are. And then this year has been a little interesting. We started doing these. They were supposed to be mini reports, but they're kind of long. But in March, we did one on NextGen women, which was super interesting. And then one on Gen Z in June, just focused on that segment. And then we'll be publishing one October 3rd. I'll be doing a webinar talking about that, and we'll be, it's on financial literacy. So we're testing the financial literacy and homebuyer education literacy of the NextGen. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can access that. You can also go to nextgenhomebuyer.com to see those past reports. So this is a topic I'm really interested in, and especially because just of the shifts that we've seen in the way that NextGen homebuyers are interacting with services or thinking about the housing market. And I'll share some of the data around that, but I want you to think for a moment about how some of those changes have occurred with your customers, or what your experience has been in understanding how NextGen homebuyers have shifted in recent years, especially since the pandemic. I mean, if you think about how technology has changed, the technology that you're using to reach borrowers or deliver an experience, think about what technology they're using and expectations around their technology usage. And then I want you to think about customer experience. What are some of the changes that you've seen around expectations in customer experience? I want you to think about things outside of the industry, like how we, when I started in this business 10 years ago, I would talk a lot about how millennials had really high expectations for having their packages delivered within 2 days. And if it's not delivered in 2 days, never would laugh and think like, oh yeah, isn't that crazy? And now we are like, yeah, of course, everything's going to be delivered in 2 days. I need things faster, and I think the way that things have been adopted, I mean, back to the technology piece, but also customer experience, using QR codes or wallet, digital wallets like Apple Pay, those kinds of things were really not used very often before the pandemic, and now have just really picked up speed, and it's expected pretty much anywhere you go. So thinking about customer experience, technology, social media, and video, how has that changed, even just in the past year? I mean, I'll share some of the data that we gathered. Now it's been a year ago around social media, and it is outdated, honestly, because things change so quickly. We don't have any data on Threads, which came into existence this year and really took, the internet by storm. We don't, TikTok, I'll share with you some of the data around that, but 2 years ago, I think it was like 12% of people said that they use TikTok to access financial education, and now it's jumped to 50%, over 50%. And I would imagine it's actually way more than that now a year later. So just thinking about some of those shifts in your experience with NextGen and how you're thinking about this. And feel free throughout the presentation to drop your questions in the question box or chat. Would love to hear from you as we move through this. So the way that we used to do business or build trust with today's consumers was built on trust in the economy, the housing market and institutions. We would be able to go down the street to our local bank or lender and say, we trust you to help us make these smart decisions. And of course, the experts. We knew that we didn't have the information, so we had to trust the experts. And today, this method of customer empowerment has completely been dismantled. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we see in the data that there's distrust in the economy. And again, this data is gathered from a year ago. I would imagine it's so much more significant today after the market that we've had over the past year. But the majority of NextGen homeowners said that they lacked confidence in the stability of the housing market. They also didn't feel confident that their home would be a good investment. And when you break this down a little bit more and you look at kind of what's making up this sentiment, you look at the median home sale price and how much that has jumped just in the last few years. And I include 2012 in here because I thought it was interesting to look at this from the past decade. 2012 to 2020, not that big of a difference, kind of makes sense. There's some mild, appreciation. Then you look at 2020 to 2023, and that's jumped so significantly that people can't even, comprehend the amount that they need to save for a down payment. That's jumped by 72% since 2020. Our incomes have certainly not kept pace with home prices. And if you are following information on social media, TikTok and Instagram, a lot of the reels that we see from NextGen influencers or a lot of general financial influencers is that homeownership is completely out of reach. And we know that that's not true completely, but we do know that there's a significant barrier here. When you look at, down payment, the biggest down payment expenses, or the expenses that have delayed the down payment for millennials, number one, student loan debt, number two, credit card debt, and then the third one, high rent. That's not as easy to get around, but the fourth one being a car loan. 3 out of 4 of these, a lot of times education could make a difference. A lot of this is due to the way that inflation and home prices and all of that has risen, but a lot of this can also be accommodated for through education. So it's an opportunity there. Credit card debt hit a record this year of $1 trillion, and that continues to grow. But when we look at then moving into distrust in the establishment, the kind of the second tier of how home buyers are, what we used to build our trust in the customer experience or be empowered, the establishment or the institution has really lost a lot of trust for consumers. This data point we gathered a couple of years ago, and really started to dig in on over the last year. But we found that 2 in 3 NextGen homebuyers said they did not think lenders were trustworthy or reliable. Now, this is not, this to me was a really shocking statistic. We know that there's a lot of distrust in the market, but when I first saw this, I thought, man, millennials really, they entered adulthood during or right after the financial crisis. So of course it makes sense that they are going to experience some kind of, a lot of distrust in financial services and the housing industry. You see this much more significant with minority groups and younger population. You see how much this jumps, and this is from the institution standpoint. So we looked at lenders, we looked at banks, and that's going to be more significant the younger and more diverse that you are. And before I think it's important to recognize that we may perceive that our customers trust us or that we have a trusted brand, and I think we all should to some degree think that way. We would hope that we believe in our own brand, but this study by PwC was really surprising to me to see that 87% of executives said that they did have a highly trusted brand, but only 30% of their customers agreed with them. So that's a pretty significant gap when you look at how consumers are thinking about trusting in a brand and what the brand thought that the trust was there. And whenever, again, I started thinking about this as this is because of the financial crisis, millennials were entering adulthood, Gen Z were watching their parents go through this, so it makes sense that you're seeing this kind of gap in trust. But when you pull out a little bit, you realize that we have been losing trust across institutions, across all industries. We saw from the Edelman Trust Barometer, who measures trust across the world, that trust is at an all-time low, going below 50% for the first time in history and dropping 10 percentage points since 2017. That's really dramatic. And you look at other industries and you see that we have been losing trust in government, healthcare, media, faith-based institutions, even just across the board, you're seeing a lot of growing distrust. So it's not just that one singular event that is coloring our experience. There's a lot going on. And if you think about the way that we, the amount of information that we have accessible to us, the kind of, the scandals that we're aware of, and I think a lot of this comes down to the information that's available to us. And that feeds into distrust in experts as well. So 1 in 3, so one of the issues is that Millennial and Gen Z consumers are now feeling like, okay, can't trust the institution, can't really trust the stability in the economy. I need to make sure that I'm becoming an expert here, which is great, but 1 in 3 don't feel that they're confident in their knowledge of personal finance. I would imagine a lot of the 2 in 3 don't actually have the financial knowledge that they need. And yet only half of them said that they have the financial advice and support they need to achieve their financial goals. So they're pretty alone, undereducated, and they're also not accessing the experts that they need. And this stat I thought was really alarming. It was interesting to see that 77% of millennials said they trust their loan officer to help them make smart decisions about their mortgage. And so first glance and looking at some of this data, I was like, okay, so we trust more the individual than the institution. That makes sense. But this drops so significantly when it comes to Gen Z. That is a dramatic drop from 77% to 58% of Gen Z saying that they trust their loan officer to help them make smart decisions about their mortgage. And I think, when we look at Gen Z data, by the way, it's not just about the 4 to 6% of home buyers that are people purchasing homes in the market today. It's about this trend that we're seeing that is impacting everyone. All of this is going to influence the way that the future of the market. And we see less trust and access to advice and support experts with women and minority groups. I'm so sorry, I need to. Okay. Okay. So women were much less likely to say that they had the advice and support they need to achieve their financial goals. And then again, when you look at minority groups and low to moderate income, they also are feeling that they don't have the access to the experts. So they're not feeling that they have the support. So ultimately, distrust has pushed us into this realm of, okay, I got to make all these decisions on my own. I now have access to unlimited information with the internet. I know how to access that information. But the problem is, and it sounds okay, like this is a solution to a problem. One of the things that comes up a lot is like, okay, this is a really difficult situation. We know we've lost trust in the experts and the institutions, and how are we going to move forward in a world like that? But this was a problem that came to life. Like, no matter what, we had to come up with a solution. And that solution that consumers have come up with is, I'm going to make smart decisions for myself. That doesn't sound too bad for customers to want to be empowered to make smart decisions for themselves. I don't think that's a bad direction. The problem with that is that we are alone going through this. We don't have the education. As I said, 1 in 3 so they don't feel confident in their personal financial knowledge. I would imagine the financial literacy is very low. We're testing for that right now. And again, they don't have the support that they need to achieve their financial goals. So while it's the way that we're handling customer empowerment today, it's not working for us because we don't know what we're doing. So how do we win in an era of distrust? How do you capture more market share in a world where your customers are very skeptical? And how do you approach the next generation of home buyers in a world where they're not trusting you? So I'm going to propose a new model, which is Customer Empowerment 2.0. And this is based on kind of like a cognitive behavioral therapy model. If you have ever gone through CBT, or you have a past life like I do as a social worker, we use a lot of that. And I think it really works here, where you think about, how do your customers feel? How do you empathize with them? And then building on that, deliver education, and ultimately, how do you engage with them and influence their behaviors? So I want to start by kind of talking about the framework here, and then we'll get into some, a few specifics. So first of all, how do your customers feel before, during, and after the home buying process? Really think about, what is it that is like, what are their experiences? And when I went to buy a home, this is the second time I was buying, but it was the first time I was buying in LA. I bought in Oklahoma, my first home, and that was such a different experience. It was still really terrifying, but I was able to buy a 3-bedroom home on a social worker salary, and it was pretty straightforward. In Los Angeles, I had a lot of messages telling me I would never be able to buy a home in Los Angeles. LA is a crazy housing market. I mean, I do remember, this is a couple years ago, so the market was really hot, but I put an offer on a home that had over 70 other offers. I think it was over 75 other offers on it. And I just felt like, oh, this is never going to happen. But even before I got into the process of getting to that point, which was really the crucial tipping point, was I was so anxious about and skeptical about the idea of buying a home here. Even though I had sold a business, I had a significant down payment that I could bring to the table. I had great credit. I've been working in this industry, creating financial literacy and education content for most of my career, but it emotion side of things really took over. And it's interesting to look back at this, because I think it wasn't until people in the industry would tell me, like, why haven't you bought a home yet? And questions like that. And I'd be like, you are trained to tell me that. And it was funny, because as I started thinking about this, I thought, man, I am acting out the exact research that I'm finding. Like, it was so specifically like, oh, I'm an anxious consumer. I'm very skeptical about the market. I'm skeptical even of experts that I know and care about. But it was still there. And so, this is what led me to realize there is a deep layer of emotion that consumers are experiencing when they come to the table that is inextricably tied to our actions. I mean, when we look at, our behaviors are ultimately very inextricably tied to our thoughts, feelings, and experiences. And I think a lot of times we don't acknowledge that when it comes to financial decisions, especially in the biggest financial decision of our lives, buying a home. That's going to be just especially prevalent. So I think it's important that we think about what are some of the anxieties they're bringing to the table. Everyone's coming to the table with a bunch of money trauma and money baggage that they're coming to this with. When I do presentations on the psychology of money, I ask people to think about what's the earliest memory you can think of around money. What was it like, thinking, or what was money like in the home where you grew up? And do you remember your parents and caregivers talking about money at home, or were they not talking about money? And either way, these things are influencing your experience and perceptions about money. In fact, there's a PBS study. This is totally a side note, but there's a lot of studies. There's one PBS study that I like a lot that talks about how your behaviors around money are ingrained in you by the age of 12. And there's a lot of other studies that show it's even younger than that. So it's really important that we recognize every consumer is coming to the table with a lot of other experiences and feelings that are outside of just logic, which is why I talk about empathy before we get into education. And the number one thing for me that ultimately changed my path and helped me decide that I'm going to decide to buy a home, or at least start down that path, was when I got a rent versus own analysis. And I had filled out some of those things online, like done a rent versus own analysis and on some of the other websites. But I think it was really helpful and moving to be able to experience that with an expert. Even though there's some distrust there, it was helpful for me to be able to ask questions and be able to look at that. And it helped me divide out, okay, you have all these anxieties, you're hearing all these messages about the market and how it's not a good time to buy, but those are just feelings. And now I can look at this from a logic standpoint, which brings us to education. Okay, I already talked through these slides. Oh, geez, okay. Sorry, I feel like maybe, oh, geez, okay. Some of my slides are not here. I'm gonna just briefly touch on the next two. The second one is education, which is, talking about what kind of education you're bringing to the table. And so in that section, it's just looking at what kind of resources do your customers need? What kinds of questions are they having? What kinds of concerns are they having? And ultimately, this is helping you empower them, because your customer wants to be seen, or wants to see you as a guide through this process, not as someone who's going to take it and run with it, but as someone who is going to be a consultant with them. Because it's really important to recognize that the distrust is there, and now we navigate this new world of distrust together as a guide or consultant, and the consumer. The consumer has a very active role here. So that's why education is so important in the way that you deliver not just your marketing and outreach, but also your customer experience. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the education that I'm doing that you can have access to. So I have hopefully a few slides at the end here. I'll talk about the nonprofit. But ultimately, if you just make sure that you're delivering education throughout the process, or at least offering to deliver that, it's really important. One thing that I realized in comparing my two experiences of buying a home and looking at how, some of the interviews I've done with other people, is that a lot of times, because NextGen or millennials are known for being so tech savvy and like wanting efficiency and all of that, that a lot of times the loan officer or the mortgage professional will say, they'll try to be really efficient with everything. The problem with that is that you become just a means to the end. So now as a customer, I'm just like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll do this really quickly. But ultimately, that's not a memorable experience. And I don't feel super confident going into finalizing that transaction. So it makes it very easy for someone with a better rate, which there will always be someone with a better rate, or someone who is more efficient. There will always be someone that's more efficient, to swoop in and take your deal. However, if you are seen as someone who is guiding them through this process, then you are a bright light in what feels like a pretty dark space. So that's the differentiator, is you are someone who is really understanding your customers' main concerns, their goals. You're delivering on guidance through this process. And I think that's then you become kind of on the inner circle with them versus someone who is just a transaction, means to the end. That's not competitive in this market. And then the last one is engagement. So I apologize. I'll just at least keep it on this slide. So engagement is ultimately looking at where are your customers active, what are their communities they already trust, and how do you engage with them. So I think it's really important to start with your network specifically and engage with them, and then expand from there. But that means, your email base and creating content that is incorporating the empathy and the education, to create engaging content in your community, through email and social media. And then also looking at where are your next gen consumers? Are there people in your life that you could partner with who they already trust? Is there a young professional organization you could be getting involved with, or an entrepreneurial organization that has a lot of young professionals in it? Or is there, and that's like a live situation. There's also influencer, those are influencers. There's also influencers on TikTok, and I would highly encourage you to not partner with someone who at a national level, but there's micro influencers who are influential in a local community. And I've seen this actually really work. But the idea is just to think outside the box and look at who are people trusting their content from, who are they already trusting for information to some degree, and how can you partner with them? That would be kind of like the next step, but initially, again, just focusing on your network and how you can build empathy and education into engaging with them. So a couple of things to mention: social media, lots of activity on social media. This is changing so constantly, and if you have questions around this, we can dig into it. But looking at, as I mentioned before, I think I have it in here. Yeah, the way that we access information has changed so dramatically. It was 49% actually, but this was again taken a year ago. So I would imagine that Twitter is probably not as high on here. TikTok is probably significantly higher. I do think Instagram is probably still at the top. But these are the social media platforms that are trusted educational resources. So this is it's important. But one thing I'll say about this is that it's very important to not bite off more than you can chew. As you've probably all attempted at some point, and I certainly have done this many times. I'm like, okay, new brand, like FirstHome IQ. Let's get our Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn going, because I need all of it. But then there's also the it's too much to do. You can't do it all, even with unlimited resources or like funding. If you had all the money in the world, you can't put that much time and effort into doing all of that and doing it well. So start with, I just interviewed James Wong a couple days ago, who's the CEO of Maxa Designs, and he's a great branding expert, and he is all about email first. Maybe start with your email database, you know, or maybe start with one channel, Instagram. I would not encourage you to do, for me, LinkedIn is helpful because I'm interacting with people like you guys on this call, but that wouldn't be one for consumers. So just choose one channel though that you feel like you already have a network there and you can start building. And then we've got video content. So again, this is a really important platform. Not just, you can ignore that stat for now, because what I want to talk about is related to the customer experience. We build trust naturally when we look at someone eye to eye. So incorporating video into your customer experience can be so helpful for really locking in a customer. And I had an experience not too long ago where I was interviewing financial advisors, and I was asking one of them, he was doing a presentation for me, and I didn't mean to not pay attention, but I was answering emails and, you know, on like answering texts and whatever, and he's doing a presentation about what it's like to work with their firm. And then halfway through the presentation, he turned on his video and he was like, oh, sorry, I didn't realize my video was on. And we were over Zoom. And, you know, I didn't have my video on, but as soon as he turned his video on, I completely locked in. I wasn't paying attention to my emails or texts anymore. And I thought about that later, kind of laughing about it, thinking like, oh, why did that matter? And I think it really humanizes someone to see them on camera. Doesn't matter age or what you look like, whatever. It's like, here's a human being in front of you. This now matters to me. So I think part of this too is like, we release oxytocin when we look someone eye to eye, so which is a bonding, kind of trusting hormone in our body. And I wonder if that plays into it. But it's the psychology, the science behind it. It really does make a difference. So I encourage everyone to start out a consultation over Zoom. It's also a really great way to allow NextGen homebuyers who may have a parent or a significant other or even a friend that they want to join that may not be present with them at that time. But they could say, hey, can you join me on this Zoom link? You know, and and as we know, Millennials and Gen Z are much closer to their parents than previous generations, and they're more likely to be in a partnership but not married. So this is a great way to help them feel more confident by opening the door to other influencers in their life as well. So I wanted to focus primarily on video as customer experience, but of course, as I mentioned previously, the stats don't line up because this is a different study, but the YouTube is also a great place for social media as well. Okay, and then lastly, we talked about this already, but partnership. So building relationships with people who you can educate with. So I talked about this a little bit by partnering with someone who is an influencer on TikTok or a leader at a young professional organization, something like that, where there's already trust there and you could partner by delivering education. I think that's a really great way to not only access a new channel of business, but also to build your brand as someone who is a trusted resource and who's investing in their communities. because the more that people see you as someone who invests in education and is active in this kind of, giving back kind of way, the more likely that as a customer who is very skeptical and distrusting, the more likely I'm going to see you as different from that. So ultimately, this is the model that I think is really most effective, and I have worked with countless lenders and banks as well in building out strategies to reach young and diverse markets. And I think it can be really encapsulated in this, always built upon that empathy, then building in the education, ultimately engaging with them. So I want to briefly touch on, I'll come back to that slide here in a second, but I want to briefly touch on FirstHome IQ because this is related to that. They add all of that actually. FirstHome IQ is a nonprofit that I started with Dave Savage and Todd Bookspan. And its focus is on educating the next generation about homeownership. So some of the points that we've talked about previously here is that young consumers are born into financial barriers. There are challenges around financial literacy, access to trusted resources, and ultimately a lot of demographic disparities as well that you've seen through this presentation. And we know that there is a financial literacy crisis in America, and that we can solve this through, at least to some degree, by delivering financial education and homeownership education to dismantle some of this. So our mission is to deliver homeownership education, inspiration, and resources to 5 million young adults before they turn 25. We know that that's, there a lot of these decisions around student loan debt and credit cards and car loans and all of that is happening in that age range, and could and does prevent people from buying homes. So we don't want to, we want to just help everyone be able to make smart decisions about their future. And the way that we're doing this is through educating students. We've created and launched a platform that has online courses, and you can see some of those here, but money basics, credit and debt management, when to rent or buy, and affordable strategies to buy. But what's interesting, and we've designed those courses for Gen Z, but we've also created a bunch of content for teachers and professionals to be able to deliver that education. So we have curriculum and all of that. For industry professionals, we have on-site presentation materials, so decks and handouts and activities, discussion questions, all of that. And we're building out a platform where ultimately we can help with volunteer matching, or at least at the beginning, if you have a connection with a school or a nonprofit or whatever, we can help manage setting up the presentations if you'd like to do that. So I think this is a great opportunity for you to build your brand as someone who is giving back in the community. If this is something you're passionate about, I think it can also benefit your business. So if you're interested in donating or volunteering, we are expanding our platform. We honestly just launched, like, I don't know if it was this week or last week because my days are running together, but we are expanding really quickly and have just launched an ambassador program for loan officers who want to donate on a per loan basis. But the idea is that no matter what your capacity is in getting involved, the idea is that we are coming together as an industry to solve these issues around education. So would love to have your involvement, whether it's, reviewing content or it's just checking out the platform, utilizing the content. Obviously, ultimately, the goal is to reach more NextGen or Gen Z students. So in whatever capacity that you'd be interested in being involved, please check it out. Again, you can go to firsthomeiq.com to access more information, or if you use this QR code or just text join to this phone number, you will get added to a text thread where we'll share announcements and updates on that as well. So I want to go back to another QR code, but it just goes to nextgenhomebuyer.com. That's where you can access all the past reports. There's also a link to that nonprofit too at that website. And there's also a new show that I've launched where I'll be sharing some of the past recordings there as well. But if you're interested, again, in any of the research or additional data that I have shared or will be sharing, you can go to nextgenhomebuyer.com. And you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I just published a report, a industry halftime report with Dave Savage, which you can find on LinkedIn as well. So I'll wrap up here a little bit early, but if there are any questions, I'd love to answer those now. And otherwise, we can wrap up.
Thanks so much, Kristin. That was excellent. We'll give folks maybe a minute or two here to see if we have any questions pop up in the chat. You know, while we're waiting, I personally had one observation and then one question. So both of them center around trust. The one slide that you shared with regard to NextGen home buyers and 2/3 of them not thinking that lenders were trustworthy or reliable. You know, I think that there's an obvious delta, right, between what these lenders believe from their own perspective in terms of being trustworthy and what the consumer believes. And I think that's the bridge that needs to be built is between being trustworthy and those feeling that you're trustworthy, right? Because you can be trustworthy all day long, but if somebody doesn't feel that you're trustworthy or believe that you are, it really doesn't matter, right?
That's the thing. Sometimes I say that stat and people are like, you know, get upset about it. And I'm like, I'm not saying that you're untrustworthy. Like, I absolutely think you are, but consumers don't know this. So yeah. Yeah.
And then the question that I was curious about with regard to Gen Z and the issues around trust, have you been able to parse, you know, along the way in your research, whether it's a question of trust that was lost or trust that just has not ever been built, or is it a combination?
I think I've definitely not parsed that out. I think that would be really interesting. But I don't think it is. I think they've lost trust in everyone, as I mentioned, and you know, across all sectors, as we talked about. But I think for Gen Z, it's just that trust hasn't been built. And you know, Gen Z, a lot of Gen Zers don't have people that they know in the industry. I think that was a challenge and has been a challenge for millennials as well. But it's increasing with Gen Z, where so many people don't know, like the mortgage industry is such a foreign concept to them, because there's not many young people in the industry. And so I think, you know, as we talk about education and outreach, some of that needs to be like, how do we recruit more people into the industry too?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it looks like still no questions so far. So as a reminder to folks, if you do have questions after we conclude here, you can certainly email Carol, who email address was on that lead slide. So with that, you know, I'll say, Kristin, thanks so much for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We greatly appreciate it, and obviously wish you all the success with FirstHome IQ. So let's see, actually, it looks like we do have a question. How do we stand out?
Chance, what do you think?
I think that who has the answer to that is got the keys to something for sure.
You know, I think some of the ways to stand out are really around being yourself. And I know that sounds, I don't know, but it's just, I think that there's a level of authenticity that really does resonate with people. So I think that's one. And then two, I think it'd be a great idea to take the information that you have available to you about the housing market, about what's going on in your local community, and be known as the expert. So like, you know, I mean, whatever resources you have available. I was interviewing Sarah Wheeler with Dave Savage for this report that we were doing, and she was talking about, you know, her role as editor-in-chief of Housing Wire, and we were like, if every loan officer would be the editor-in-chief of, you know, in their local community, consumers would see that as such a differentiator. You know, as someone who's like, okay, I want to follow your content because I want to know what's going on in my local housing market, or what higher interest rates means for my payment. And so I think incorporating some of that and just repurposing it and being, you know, being able to make that local to your community would be a way to stand out.
Sure, sure. And it looks like we've had a little bit more context posted here, which I think that you just spoke to, but I'll say it all the same. So it says, you mentioned using TikTok, Instagram, et cetera, to become or use a micro influencer. Please give some clarity on how to decipher the mindset of Gen Z in that frame of thought. Essentially, every other feed on those platforms is selling something, and so that led up to the kind of standout. So yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's exactly what I was talking about. Of like how you are, it's going to be really important not to be selling. It's about how do you be a leader, and, you know, think of that as like, I am the editor or leader in your market, and that means that you encourage people to reach out for a free consultation, but you're not going to tell people, you know, like make it into a sales pitch. So I think that that's a really important. And also, you know, if you hear a message or see something that's like, this isn't true, you know, if you provide your voice over it and say, hey, I saw this article, or I saw this, you know, TikTok or whatever, and you say this part is true, this part isn't, or you are sharing like a little more context on that, let me give you some information, that can be really a great way to stand out too.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point. I think there's also something to be said too for consistency, right? In whatever we're trying to do to be consistent, and you know, building relationships, building, you know, a brand or what have you.
Yeah, I was talking to someone recently who was it? It was someone who'd been successful. Oh, he built an influencer division at his company, and he was like, you got to know your first 100 TikToks are not going to do anything. If you're going to be on TikTok, you got to be really, really consistent and know that the first 100 are going to fail, but you just got to keep going. And I was like, man, we haven't launched a TikTok for FirstHome IQ yet, but we know we need to. And like whatever platform you are going to be using, whether it is on social media or it's, you know, in person, like showing up at some kind of community event, these are going to take a while to build that funnel, but now is a really great time to do that. So.
Yeah, agreed. All right, well, I don't see any other questions. Give it maybe one more minute here. Well, again, thank you so much, Kristin, for your time. Let's see, no other questions, but the question asker said thank you. So there we go.
Great.
So again, Kristin, thanks so much for your time. To all of our attendees, we thank you for your time today. The TMBA Education Endowment Committee continues to work to bring you great webinars like this one. Please check the homepage at texasmba.org for upcoming webinar schedule, and please watch for emails from the TMBA reminding you to register. So with that, I think I can say thank you all and have a great day, and we will see you next month. Kristin, thanks again.
Thank you.